drop my junk. Jeff, I'm gonna grab my stuff in the back corner.
We're going to get started shortly, so I just want to invite everybody who's maybe in the back to find a seat. There are quite a few seats up here on my right, your left. Lots of nice open seats here. You'd think we're Catholic or something. The front row's always open.
Sure. We're all Jayhawks right here, so.
Well, welcome everyone. We're so glad to have such a great crowd here today. I know you're all wearing red in honor of Saints Cyril and Methodius, martyrs, bishops, and high-class educators who gave us the Cyrillic alphabet, among many other things, as they were missioned to the Slavic peoples. Or there's this other saint you may have heard of, Saint Valentine. Apparently it's his day too. So we're so glad you could be here. I was given the task of introducing Bishop Conley, which led me down the rabbit hole of how did I learn about Bishop Conley in the first place? And I still haven't gotten to a sufficient answer. But it's one of those interesting things about certain bishops that we're very blessed to have in the church. When you start to learn their story and read their writings, it's sort of like you become friends with them before you've met them. And then when you meet them, it's like, oh, Bishop Conley, I've known you for 30 seconds and I've already embarrassed myself. But that is how I feel with Bishop Conley. And so I got to learn a lot about him when I was reading the biography that someone so nicely prepared for me. Because good news, we can claim Bishop Conley as a native Kansan, and obviously he's a beloved Raven, regardless of perhaps never having attended Benedictine college course. But we claim him as a satellite of Lincoln, and he will tell you a fascinating story about why that claim should be held for perpetuity, thanks to the Benedictines here and their connection to the Diocese of Lincoln. But he's a native Kansan, and one of the things, I don't want to steal too much of his thunder because he has a wonderful story that he is going to share with you. But as you may have heard, he was a graduate of KU's Integrated Humanities program of great fame, and something that is really gaining a greater knowledge and standing in the world of education as we continue to wrestle with this great question of who is the human person and what is the good life, and how do we perpetuate that through the formation of young people and within our own selves to continue the education and learning process well into our favorite years, our later years, the years of great blessedness and wisdom. And so there is a very long history here. Originally, the bishop was ordained a priest for the Diocese of Wichita and has a long list of wonderful other educational pursuits, among which he landed as the auxiliary bishop in Denver under Archbishop Chaput, and then served as the apostolic administrator there until the appointment of current Archbishop Aquila. at which time he resumed his auxiliary bishop status until they sent him to the great diocese of Lincoln, Nebraska. Yes, there you are. I knew we had a strong showing here from Lincoln. And of course, they're always looking for good Catholic school teachers, just in case you were unaware. And it's a great place to be. And so I could say many, many more things, but one of the things that I have come to know about Bishop Conley is he often tells his stories much better than anybody else could. And he has inspired me in his vision for Catholic education as it should be, and also for his vision and witness to the dignity and sanctity of human personhood, both through the leadership he shows in Nebraska as they've fought against some pretty pernicious laws trying to attack the dignity of life, but even more so in his personal witness of maintaining his own health and making sure that he remains healthy and strong to serve in the way Christ has called him to serve the great people of Lincoln, Nebraska, and by extension, through his teaching, many, many more of us in this age where all we have to do is click on a link and read, ooh, the joy of Catholic education. I want to read about that. And so without further ado, and hopefully without too much embarrassment, I would love to present to you Bishop Conley from Lincoln, Nebraska, to give today's lecture.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Kristen. And I'm so humbled to see such a large turnout. I thought we were just going to have like a little circle of people, but this is great. This is great to have you. And thank you for taking time off your Friday afternoon. That's precious time because the weekend is here, and so I'm just so grateful that you're here and come to this lecture. There is a connection. This morning I had Mass at one of our parishes in Nebraska City, St. Mary's, and Our Lady of Lourdes. It's a K through 12 school, and there's a little elementary school in Nebraska City called St. Benedict's, and St. Benedict's was the first Catholic school in the state of Nebraska. It was founded in 1861, and it was founded by a Benedictine monk from St. Benedict's Abbey, Father Emmanuel Hartig, who his fingerprints are all over southeastern Nebraska. He founded many parishes, but for our purposes, because this was the conclusion of Catholic Schools Week, which we extended it a little bit so we could celebrate the Our Lady of Lourdes as well. But he established the first school in my diocese. So there's that link with Benedictine College, and of course, Father Schwenke, who's here doing a degree and serving as chaplain for all of you, as well as our sisters, Sister Joy, Sister Kateri, and Sister Catherine are here. And so we also have the CK sisters, the School Sisters of Christ the King, you might see them on campus here too. So we've got a lot of links with Benedictine College, and it's always been, had a special place in my heart. So I want to just start by just saying, by way of introduction, I think there's a great moment happening in culture today, and it has to do with a renewal of what, some people might think of as sort of a classical view of the world, but I don't like to use the C word too much because it kind of gives bad connotations. But it's a renewal of really the big C, Catholic education, and Catholic healthcare. So I love your motto for the college, the transformation, transform culture in America, because I think that's really what's happening here at Benedictine College in all the different areas in which you are. And I know that a lot of students are in different disciplines, different majors, but the beautiful thing about Benedictine College is it's mission driven, and you have, you get a full view, you get a sort of a full picture of the human person. In my little pastoral letter that is available to you guys out front, I quote St. Irenaeus at the very beginning of it. It's if you haven't had one, they're available out in the foyer. But he had this great quote: "The glory of God is man fully alive. The glory of God is man fully alive, and God wants each of us to be fully alive in every aspect and all what that means." The purpose of life. And so a lot of it begins with education. We really can't be fully alive unless we know what it means to be fully alive, right? That we have a purpose and vision for life. And I think that we're experiencing in our culture a sort of a transformation within, a kind of a renewal. I think your generation, especially I'm talking to college students, you've lived in, Gen Z, you've grown up sort of in a digital age. And, a lot of college students are looking around at the landscape in which they live and the environment and looking at the world and what the world offers for happiness and purpose in life and, the good life. I'm from Nebraska. That's sort of one of our mottos, the good life. What is the good life? And they look around and they see what the world is offering and they say, are you kidding me? Is this all there is? Shouldn't there be something more? And then they get a glimpse, of someone who is fully alive, in their faith. They're joyful, they're normal, and they're seeing the world through a different lens. And that lens is really what I want to talk about. The joy and wonder, to be reborn in wonder. And it happened to me in a very sort of surprising way many years ago. And I think that, as Kristen kind of mentioned, I went through a crisis in my own life, mental health. I had to take about 11 months off dealing with anxiety and depression, and I didn't think I'd ever come back to be bishop again. I would say, well, maybe God wants me just to kind of go off into the sunset. I've done this bishop thing for a while. I've been a bishop for 16 years, by the way. And it's not an easy job. And so I thought, well, maybe this is it. I've done what I could do. But the Lord gave me a second chance, and through the help of many people who came alongside of me during my crisis, I was able to get through that difficult time. And I was having a conversation with President Minnis about this, and he was asking me how I was. He hadn't seen me since I'd come back from my leave. And I was telling him that, I think the Lord has given me a second chance. And so what am I going to do with that second chance? And I was, through my own prayer, I was thinking, well, Jesus was primarily a teacher and a healer. When he rose from the dead and St. Mary Magdalene discovered him, she didn't know who he was at first, and then he called her by name, and she responded. She didn't say Jesus. She didn't say Lord. She didn't say Master. She said Rabboni, teacher. And that was the most popular title that Jesus held, was teacher. The teacher is here. And he would be going from village to village teaching. But also he was a healer. He healed. Today's gospel, he's got a beautiful story of healing. But we know that healings are throughout the whole. And we've just gone through in the cycle of readings for the Mass this week, the story of Genesis and the fall. He came to heal us from our own sin, our own sinfulness, our selfishness, turned in on ourselves. And he came to bring about a new way of healing and of looking at the world in a holistic way. So he was primarily a teacher and a healer. So the Catholic Church has been involved in education and in healthcare from the very beginning. So I kind of thought, well, in the years the Lord has left for me as bishop, since I got the second chance, I'm going to focus on Catholic education and Catholic healthcare. Both areas are very important because we're all affected by education and we're all affected by healthcare. We all need physicians, right? We need doctors, we need nurses, we need people to help us, especially when we get sick. And so I am the National Episcopal Advisor to the Catholic Medical Association and the founding board member of the Catholic Healthcare Leadership Alliance, which is an effort to bring healthcare back to a Christ-centered healing vision for healthcare, looking at new ways we deliver healthcare, whether it be mycatholicdoctor.com, which is a great new innovative healthcare delivery system, to small clinics that are springing up all over the country. And there's a renewal going on in medicine, believe it or not. We did a MedCon here a couple years ago for pre-med students to kind of bring this vision to young medical students. But also education, and that's probably where the area that I feel most comfortable in. I didn't have any science background. I was an English major, so, but I do see how they're related. So, like I said, these two areas, are very close to my heart. And I'm deeply engaged in both. And the origins of, and with that, that's my introduction, okay? Sorry, that's my introduction. Not so brief. But anyway, that's my introduction. So how did I get to where I am on this? Well, the title of the talk, which really thank you, Kristen, for that title, because I think it really does capture what it was. And if you didn't get a chance to see this, it said, the title of the talk is Let Them Be Born in Wonder. And the little paragraph is Exposure to the Humanities, the best that God has known and said, in the words of Matthew Arnold, helps us to know ourselves. The humanities teach us about humanity, both our own humanity and the humanity of our neighbor. The humanities also teach us, in the words of Joseph Pearce, quote, that the human person is a homo viator, a pilgrim, a wayfarer. And that's really apropos because we're to be pilgrims of hope during this Jubilee year of 2025. A wayfarer who journeys through mortal life with eternal life in mind. As our professor used to say, we should set our sights on the stars, but our feet are firmly grounded in the soil. So this experience that I had at the Integrated Humanities program really shaped my whole life. And we're going back to over 50 years ago. So I grew up in Overland Park, Kansas. Anybody from Johnson County, Kansas in here? There's got to be some. Okay. So you know where that is. It's the suburbs of Kansas City. And I grew up as a typical kid of the 1970s. I went to a big public high school, Shawnee Mission West, go Vikings. And 714 were in my graduating class. And so it was a big public high school, and I didn't really have I wasn't a very good student, first of all. And I didn't really have a very good education. And I don't think I ever read a book all the way through during my whole career up until I became a freshman in college. And so I wasn't, I was a typical kid of the 70s, but I was not, when I talk about the Integrated Humanities program, it sounds like it's sort of an advanced placement program for gifted. No, not at all. I was not gifted, nor was I advanced placed. I was just a normal kid of the 70s. Like I say in my pastoral letter, I was into basketball and the Grateful Dead. And KU had both of those. Had a great basketball tradition and great rock and roll music. And so that's where I landed in 1973 when I came up as a freshman. And my dad was my hero, and he didn't really have any religion at all, but he fought during World War II. He was of the greatest generation. He was a gunner on an aircraft carrier. He also played professional baseball, signed for the New York Yankees, never made it to the bigs, but he was my coach all through my formative years. And he was typical of that generation, a self-made man. And so and I had no religious training or formation growing up. I went to the Village Presbyterian Church, if you know where that is, in Prairie Village. But I didn't have any religious formation, so I really was sort of like a blank slate. I was probably just a happy agnostic. I didn't really have any thoughts at all about is there a God, or if there is, okay, fine, but I'm more interested in the Grateful Dead or whatever. And so when I came to the university, there was a college fair at my high school, and it had a bunch of brochures on the table for different programs. I wanted to go to KU, but I didn't want to. I just wanted to go there because all my friends were going there, and I didn't really have any intention of getting involved in anything that was significant. But there was this brochure, which was, I dug it out of a box that I brought down, and I'll leave it out there so you can take a look at it. It's called the Pearson Integrated Humanities Program, Nascantur in Admiratione, which is a Latin phrase which means let them be born in wonder. And you open it up, and there's a picture of a student here, long hair, typical of a student in the 1970s, pondering these great ideas. Wonder is the passion of the philosopher, Plato. The happy life is rejoicing in the truth, St. Augustine. The heavens declare the glory of God, from the Psalms. Anyway, this is the rarest dream, that ere dull sleep did mock sad fools withal, Shakespeare. So, all these quotes, I didn't know. By the way, the picture of the long-haired guy there, he's the current abbot of Clear Creek Abbey. Abbot Anderson, Phil Anderson. So we were sort of, and he went to Shawnee Mission East High School, so it was another one of these big public high schools. So we had no clue of what was going to happen. And so I enrolled in this program, and and I began taking these classes. It was a 4-semester program over 2 years, 6 hours a semester. That's a big chunk, right, for freshmen and sophomores. But it also satisfied all of your gen ed courses, your English literature, your speech, your Western Civ. And it also had a Latin component. You could take Latin, so you could take 5 hours of Latin as well. So you could have 11 hours of this integrated humanities program. I, to be honest, took it because I could knock off all these boring classes in one shot. I wasn't any altruistic reason for taking it. But again, it was this program that was sort of kind of interesting to me. I didn't really know what to think of it. And so I enrolled, as did many others during that time. And when I got into it, it wasn't first love at first sight, but things started to work on me. And the first semester we read the Greeks, so we started with the Odyssey. That was the very first book we read. But we read the Iliad, we read Aesop's Fables, a little bit of Plato, a few kind of smattering of the Greek tragedy plays. Second semester we read Roman authors, started with the Aeneid, the history of Rome. We read Caesar's Gallic Wars. The guys really liked that book, the high body count. And we read Ovid and Lucretius and Plutarch's Lives of the great Romans. And that was the first whole year, which was all pagan. We didn't read one Christian author. The next year, we began with little passages from the Bible, like the Psalms, but read as literature, not as religion, because you couldn't. It was a state university. But then we read the Confessions of St. Augustine, Boethius. Those were pivotal books in my conversion. The life of Charlemagne, Chronicles of the Crusades. And we ended that semester reading The Little Flowers of St. Francis of Assisi. I didn't even know what a saint was, but I knew that there was this strange medieval character who used to live outside and sleep in the hills and used to say beautiful things about nature and all this kind of thing. So that was my introduction to St. Francis. And then the last semester, we started with the Canterbury Tales from Chaucer. And we read Don Quixote, which Don Quixote sort of became the emblematic motto of the knight on horseback jousting at the windmills who he thought were dragons, and just this sort of chivalric, spirited person, romantic person. And then we read Shakespeare plays, a couple of Shakespeare's plays. We read some of the modern philosophers like Kant and Hume and Descartes. And then we read Newman, John Henry Newman, in the Uses of Knowledge. Then we read, and I'm leaving out some books, we read some Dickens novels, The Tale of Two Cities, about the French Revolution. And the last book we read was The Oregon Trail, which was a great American story of voyage and pilgrimage. So that was the whole, that was the corpus of the books. And like I said, I wasn't a big reader, but it introduced ideas to me for the first time that I never really thought of before. But what made the program unique was the fact that the professors taught this course by what they called the poetic mode of education. In other words, they wanted to instill a sense of wonder in us by reading these books. So it wasn't a kind of a journey of the head, it was a journey of the heart. And they realized that the students were pretty flat-souled, that they really didn't have any imagination, coming up onto the campus. And I remember there's a story about an argument, kind of a friendly argument that took place between John Sr., who was one of the three professors, and Dr. Ronald MacArthur, who was the founding president of Thomas Aquinas College in California. And they were good friends, but they had this argument in the late 60s. And I found the letters. I had to give the commencement address at Thomas Aquinas College 2 years ago, so I went into the archives to find out some of these stories. And they had these letters, beautiful letters back and forth. And MacArthur was arguing, he said, the problem with modern education today is that there's a crisis of reason, that students aren't thinking critically. So they need logic and philosophy and St. Thomas Aquinas. And so he went off and founded TAC. And Senior said, I don't disagree with you, Ron. I think it's true, that there is a crisis of reason. But the big problem is the crisis of the imagination. They have no poetry. They have no lyric in their hearts. And you can't teach philosophy unless you can't read the 100 great books until you read the 1,000 good books. And so that's what the integrated humanities was all about, was immersing us into truth and goodness and beauty through not just literature, but in all kinds of experiential things, with the real, as Senior used to say, with the really real. For example, every lecture on Tuesdays and Thursdays would begin with a song. And so as a freshman, I remember sitting there in one of the first couple of classes, and usually it was an upperclassman, usually it was a female, usually she was very pretty, and she had a beautiful voice. And she would come out, and she maybe have a guitar, and she would teach. She would sing a couple of songs, and we would learn these songs, like simple songs like Home on the Range, My Old Kentucky Home was one. Flow Gently, Sweet Afton, Believe Me If All Those Endearing Young Charms, some great English ballads. And the idea there was to start the class with a little bit of music, to build up sort of a repertoire of music in our imaginations, And of course, outside of class, you end up humming these songs, or you're at a party on a Friday night and somebody starts singing one of these songs, and so it had kind of a big impact on our social life as well. And then they would proceed to lecture, and there were 3 of them that would lecture, and they would just they would always begin every lecture by the same thing. They'd say, well, as we were talking about last time, and they would go right into whatever they're talking about, the Odyssey or whatever it was, and St. Augustine or whatever. And they would just all kind of, it was like a conversation that they were having amongst themselves, and we were sort of privy to it. And the interesting thing is that we couldn't take notes. We had to have our desk clear. And they were really kind of teaching us just to listen. Just to listen. Is this going to be on the test? Don't worry about that, Don't worry, just listen to what we have to say. That was a hard thing, because, we want to take notes because I want to make sure I get a good grade on the test. But they despised grades. We liked that. They didn't, in fact, the exams, we only had one test, and it was an oral exam. It was kind of frightening because you'd have 15 minutes with these 3 professors, and they would ask you questions, and they could tell within 5 minutes if you'd read the books, if you knew what you were talking about. And that's how they graded us. And of course, some people were upset. They said, well, I didn't deserve a B. They didn't care. They didn't care. And it was part of that whole idea to get you free, that you're learning knowledge for knowledge's sake. If you work hard, you'll get a good grade, but don't worry about the tests. So that lecture was very pivotal, but then in addition to the poetry, we would also, on every other week, we would go out into the countryside outside of Lawrence and learn the constellations of the stars. And by the way, the planets are lining up right now. So you've got Saturn and Jupiter and Venus and Mars. They're all visible. And also one other planet. It's unusual. I didn't know this, but somebody was pointing it out to me the other night. So to be able to identify the constellations, because we were reading the mythology of the Greeks, and so all of these myths were, the constellations are named after these Greek goddesses and Greek gods. And so they were kind of making connections with the books as well. Then we would have 1 hour of discussion in small groups. So we could actually discuss the content of the books and ask questions. And usually it wasn't one of the professors, but it was one of the older students that would help us to make sure that we're reading and understanding the books. And it kind of kept us reading, because you could blow off reading until the test time. Well, you had to kind of, if you want to participate in these classes, you had to at least kind of appear like you know what you're talking about. I faked a lot of it myself, but anyway, that's another story. But so we had the rhetoric class. We also, interesting, this brochure was all handwritten by one of the students in calligraphy. You can see the script. See it? And So that was one of the other things too, is they taught us how to use an Osmeroid pen to write in beautiful script. Now some of us were better than, I was not very good, but some of us were really good at that. And so learning how to write beautifully was part of it as well. That's why they call it the Integrated Humanities Program, because it integrated all these things together. In the fall, we would always have this outdoor fall festival that the students would put on, and it would have games and all kinds of things and music, and it was just to kind of get all the students together in outdoors. They were big on being outdoors, and to experience the beauty of creation, especially in the fall, where the leaves were changing and nature was transitioning from fall to winter. And then the highlight of the year was in the springtime, and there would always be a spring waltz. Now, none of us knew how to waltz, right? I mean, if you've ever been to well, you probably haven't been to a Grateful Dead concert, but that's not waltzing. That is just not, I don't know what it is. But anyway, so we had to take waltzing lessons, and we took those for like 2 months prior to the waltz. And we had to have someone who knew how to waltz to teach us. And it's not complicated, but it takes a rhythm and coordination. And of course, the guys didn't want to step on, the girls' feet and look like a klutz, so we had to really learn how to, and we also had to learn everything around dancing. So like, for example, when we'd have the waltz, and it was towards the end of the semester in the spring, and we would rent out the university ballroom, the KU ballroom, and we would hire the university orchestra. So it was important to have a live orchestra. And the whole evening would be a series of Strauss waltzes, maybe 6 of them. And you'd get a dance card, and you'd have 6 different ladies' names on there. And you'd have to find out, first of all, where she is. And then there were name tags and things like that. And then you had to kind of escort her out onto the dance floor and dance this dance, and then take her back to her table, and then go to someone else. And so, the idea there was to help the men become gentlemen and the women to become ladies. And when when you're in this real uncomfortable tuxedo, and the women are in these long gowns, it takes on a whole different sort of atmosphere. Needless to say, there were a lot of romances at those waltzes. And then there were after waltz parties and after waltz parties, and all into the night, that it would extend, this whole amazing experience. And that was really the highlight of the year, especially for socially, that was the highlight of the year. But all of this was kind of integrated into a whole experience, which was the integrated humanity. And the whole purpose is, let them be born in wonder, nascantur and admiratione. And it worked. I mean, we were reborn in wonder. I used to say that I read my way into the Catholic Church, which is true to a certain extent, because there was intellectually reading these great works of literature and philosophy and theology, my brain, I was starting to think about things more seriously, about is there a God, where is the God, that kinds of things. So that was happening. But as I got older, I realized, it was more of a journey of the heart than of the head. And that was where the poetic mode of education came in. Yes, there were things happening in my mind, but it was really the friendships that I made and the people who I'm still friends with today that were formed during those years, who were also together on this journey. And we all were sort of walking this journey together. And that community of learning, that community of life, of faith, of friendship was key. And I see that happening here. I mean, little communities, micro communities, larger communities in the larger college, you guys are experiencing that yourselves in a different way, maybe, than I did. But it's the same idea, that you're growing in your virtues, you're growing in your knowledge of one another, of yourself, of God. This is a Catholic college, so you're actually able to receive the sacraments, and that's a beautiful thing. But this is really, I think, at the heart of what learning is all about. So halfway through my junior year, I was sort of connecting the dots, and a lot of other people were as well. So there started to be this sort of conversions to the Catholic faith. And because when we were reading these great works of literature and studying art and poetry and music, whether it be a great Mozart piece of music or a Strauss waltz or a beautiful painting by Da Vinci, a lot of them had religious themes, and a lot of them were rooted in the Catholic faith. Like a beautiful, I know there's an architecture affair tomorrow, like for instance the building of Chartres, or building of Paris, of Notre Dame in Paris. The restoration of the Cathedral of Notre Dame, which was just reconsecrated on December 8th, is a beautiful example of how the faith inspired the creation of something extraordinary. I mean, no amount of technology, no amount of other than the love and the glory of God could build a Chartres or Notre Dame. And those kinds of things kind of started to resonate with me. So what is motivating this? Where is this coming from? And ultimately, the truth and goodness and beauty with capital T, G, and B is God and the Trinity. And so before I knew it, I was starting to think, well, I think I believe in God, and I think God, the God I believe in is in the Catholic Church. And so it's interesting how I ended up it's before the RCIA program, or OCIA as they call it now. But I was living with a guy, and he was dating a girl, and she was this kind of fundamentalist evangelical Protestant. He was a philosophy major, so they were always getting in arguments with philosophy and religion. She was quoting the Bible, he was quoting Aristotle, back and forth, back and forth. And finally he convinced her to just go to one of these classes, but she refused to do it because he was too much of an influence on her. But she felt safe to go with his roommate, which was me. Very non-threatening, kind of this deadhead guy that was a threat to no one. And so I started going to these classes, and for me, everything clicked. Everything connected. I just knew I had to become Catholic. And so I came home and I told my roommates, there were two of them, one who is the current Archbishop of Oklahoma City. I said, I'm going to become Catholic. And so Archbishop Conley said, this is great. I've been praying for you. That's good. And Alan had this sort of look on his face. He says, what about Diane? I said, well, I don't think she's converting. What? It's not supposed to happen like that. She's the one that's supposed to convert. I said, well, anyway, she did eventually convert, and so I went home after my first semester of my junior year, and I did something that I don't recommend doing. I never told my parents that I became Catholic, and so I think it's like Christmas dinner or something. I said, though, by the way, I became a Catholic. Pass the potatoes, please. And I remember my mom said, oh, isn't that nice? I'm so glad you've got religion and you're going to go to church now. And isn't that nice, Carl? Isn't that nice? And my dad had this look on his face and he goes, I knew it. You've just given up your freedom to think on your own. He, again, World War II, kind of self-made man. The Catholic Church is going to make all your decisions for you now. The Pope is going to dictate your life. I hope you know you've given up your freedom to think on your own. And of course, I got in this big argument. I said, no, I can still think on my own. Fast forward 15 years, and I'm already in this. I'm a priest for 5 years now, young priest, and studying in Rome, actually, doing a graduate degree. And I get a letter from my mom saying, well, your father and I have decided to become Catholic. And, we discovered also that we've never been baptized. And so we would like for you to baptize us and confirm us and give us our first Holy Communion. So, of course, that was, just such a joy. And so I came back in my first parish, and so my friends were there, my priest buddies, my bishop came, everybody came, the parishioners there. And so, true story, my mom steps up to the baptismal font, and I baptize her in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit steps up. My dad steps up, and just before I poured the water, I said, Dad, now, are you sure I'm going to do this? If I do this, you're going to have to give up your freedom to think on your own. The Catholic Church is going to do all your thinking for you. Are you sure you want me to do this? And he said, yeah, go ahead. And they became devout Catholics, till they're both deceased now. But, next to my ordination, that was really the happiest day of my life. So all of that kind of had, all of that really kind of was a result of my experience in college. And that effect, there were over 300 conversions during a 10-year period from 1970 to 1980. So much so that one of the students, who was a classmate of mine, Jeannie Bangs, her dad was a Unitarian minister in Overland Park. He and a bunch of parents of Jewish kids who converted filed a lawsuit against the University of Kansas for a violation of church and state. And they got the American Civil Liberties Union and the Jewish Defense League to join in on the lawsuit. And there were these hearings. Now, this was a time when there were a lot of cults on campuses, like Hare Krishnas, and the Moonies. You probably don't remember the Moonies, but so they thought this was a Catholic cult, and they thought these professors were proselytizing. Well, the thing was, it made the program even more popular. But they did have these hearings, and I remember the dean, Dean Del Shankel, who was a colleague of Senior Quinn and Nellick, the professors. And by the way, these professors, they all had received the highest award. They were all tenured professors, and they'd received the highest award given by students for teaching, the Hope Award. So their credentials were impeccable. And I could witness to you that they didn't teach religion. They in fact, if you asked them about it, they said, well, go see the priest. It was before the Newman Center, before St. Lawrence Center. Go see the priest, and if you want to look into religion, it's fine. So anyway, there were a couple of hearings, and they completely threw it out. So there's no evidence of any proselytizing. They're just teaching what they've always been teaching, the great books, But it had an effect of the professors themselves were sort of aging, getting older, and what they did, we called it death by administration. What they did was they removed the credits, it became an elective. Well, can you imagine taking a 6-hour elective course your freshman year? I mean, you've got to get your general education courses down, and so that kind of pulled the rug out from underneath the program. So it no longer satisfied all of these requirements. And so that really kind of really had a devastating effect on the program. But they continued to be taught for a while, and the two other professors retired, but one kept teaching for a while. But overall, it had this kind of amazing, transforming effect on so many students. Not just, those of us who became priests, a couple of bishops, an abbot, but also families, many families who came into the church and had children, and then one of the direct fruits of the program is Wyoming Catholic College in Wyoming. So I was on the founders committee. There were 6 of us from the program that were part of an 8-member founders committee that started that college. St. Gregory's Academy in Scranton, Pennsylvania, the boys' boarding school, and St. Martin's now in Fort Scott were all kind of a direct result of the experience of the Integrated Humanities program. So all these things were, sort of fruits of a program that didn't really last very long. It was just a short period of time, and really a small kind of number of students over that period of time. And yet the ripple effect has been amazing. So like as Kristen was saying, I bump into people all the time who've heard of the Integrated Humanities, who've heard of John Senior, who was my godfather. When I became Catholic, I asked him to be my god. He had tons of godchildren, so I wasn't the only guy. But the impact of that program over the years on the lives of so many people was just amazing. So I think it's kind of scattered here and that. Maybe we'll take some time for some questions. One of the things I wanted to point out too was that I think that I was doing a little, what was that podcast or whatever it was called? Benedictine Dialogue. And it was talking about, a little bit about, your generation. We say Gen Z. Anybody that's under 30, and most of you guys are under 30. So much of the world in which we live is in our heads. And technology has created this for us, where we live a lot of our lives in our own heads, which is not healthy. Like Chris Stefanik says, the mind is like a dark forest. Don't go in there alone. And it's true. So the more time we spend kind of in our own minds, and I'm talking about things like social media, but not just social media, but everything, the technology brings. So you've got everything at your fingertips, all the data information streaming at you 24/7 like never before in the history of the world. And you're expected to make sense of it. Impossible. You can't. It's overwhelming. Somebody said we live in a culture that permits everything and forgives nothing. You're expected to make sense of all this. And it's impossible. And that's why I think there's the rise in mental illness, because it's just overwhelming. We become anxious, and we can't assimilate this. And so one of the ways to counter this, and again, we can't get rid of technology. I mean, people have tried that. You can't do that. You can't go off the grid. I mean, some people do. The Benedict option is one option some people do, but I'm not advocating that, because I can't. I'm a bishop, right? I got to be connected. I got an Instagram page, I got a Facebook page, I got all that stuff. X, I got all that stuff. I don't deal. I've got a communication director that does it for me, so that's nice. But I have. That's where people are, and that's where the church has to be. But there has to be a balance where you're not always there, because you can't sustain that. You have to balance that with real things, real relationships, eyeball to eyeball, friendships that are friends, not just friends on social media, but real friendships and real conversations and real interaction, human interaction, and the outdoors. To be outside, to have contact with real things like the stars, to take time to go for a walk, in a freezing, Kansas winter night. It's bracing, right? But that's all good. That's healthy. And we need that. And we have to incorporate that in our lives, so that we have this balance in our lives, so that we don't end up like where I ended up, kind of all in my own head. Because the pressures and demands that are expected in culture are too much. And so, one of the things Monsignor Shea, he was giving a talk at Seek, and he was talking, and he had all of his University of Mary students, there were like 300 of them. And he was talking about, dealing with, anxiety and depression and different things that the college students were going. And he said, and he looked at us and he said, and you guys just are a mess. And they all started laughing, And the thing he says, but that's the proper response. That really is. I mean, that's really kind of a natural response to this overwhelming tsunami. It's anxiety. And so people are just reacting the way they probably should, because the human person can't take it all in. And so you've got to find ways, to kind of to separate it and balance it out, so that you're not always in that world, because you can't sustain it. And that's why I think a good liberal arts education, a good grounding in these perennial truths, whether they're through literature and again, even, the STEM courses are great. Mathematics and science, and these kinds of things also can be pathways to the divine. Because God created everything. And we have to see everything through a sacramental imagination, through the lens of our faith. But we have to have real experiences, I remember one of the, and I'll stop here. I know I said that already. But one of the things, I remember Dr. Nellick, who was one of the three professors, and he was a World War II pilot, a fighter pilot in World War II. And then after he got out of the war, he used to fly stunt planes with Eddie Rickenbacker, like these crazy things. He should have killed himself a long time before he ever, but he was this, and he drove a red Corvette, and he was just kind of this guy that everybody was in fear of. And he carried a switchblade too. And he right in the middle, and he'd smoke Camel non-filter cigarettes during class. So he'd be smoking, this is when you could smoke in classroom. He'd be smoking the cigarette, and he'd be like, and he'd look out, and then he'd take his switchblade out, and he'd kind of clean his fingernails, But, I mean, he was a character. But, everybody was just like, what is he going to say? But one of the things he used to say, and I'll end with this, I promise. One of the things he used to say that has always stuck with me, he said, rocks are hard and water is wet. Rocks are hard and water is wet. What he was doing was distilling down reality to to the fundamental things. In other words, you cannot, he's destroying moral relativism. You know, if you get hit in the head with a rock, you can't explain that away. That rock is hard and you're going to hurt. Or if somebody throws you in a swimming pool or a lake, you know, you're going to experience water and you can't explain it. That's reality. So that was one of the things I never forgot. You know, we have to be grounded in these real things, not virtual things, but real things. Rocks are hard and water's wet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bishop Conley. So if you want to grab a sip of water while we see if there are some questions in the audience here. All right, you get the first hand in the air back there. Yes, you, good sir. You.
I just wanted to ask a little bit about a phenomenon that I think you brought up a little bit that I experienced even just earlier today. I was reading a poem, quite a long poem, and I didn't even quite, I understood the words, but I didn't quite understand the concept that it was trying to portray, or at least why that concept was beautiful. But for some reason, I still experienced that beauty, and I, kind of felt the warmth in my cheeks, and I was like, life felt like it was in slow motion, and I was just blown away. But I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about how that's rationally possible, that we can experience beauty that we don't even understand.
Right. No, that's a great example. Thank you for that. That is an experience of wonder and beauty, and we receive it. We can experience in a poem like that, especially if you probably were quiet and you were reading through it, and all of a sudden just sort of like not even understanding the words. That's a lot of things. We want to, like Frost says, we murder to dissect. We want to say, well, what does this mean? What is it? Well, don't worry about it. Just listen to it. Experience it. It's kind of like music. Sometimes you'll hear a piece of music, that's just an instrumental music, not any words to it, and you'll be lifted up. There'll be a delight. That's what you experienced was delight, because that's what really wonder leads to, is delight. There's a joy, and we've all experienced it. There's a joy in experiencing this beauty that you really can't rationally explain. Like, I wish I could explain it, in a rational way. But it's something that you experienced. And it really defies any kind of definition. And it's a good point, because, we live in a society that wants to quantify everything. We want to be able to show metrics of what this does and why it does and all this kind of thing. And instead of just delighting in the thing itself, like looking up at the stars, and just sort of like for a few minutes and just looking at that and wondering. But those kinds of experiences can happen in reading a poem, in a conversation, in a beautiful sunrise or sunset. And that's where I think then I think it really does get into supernatural, that God touches our hearts in a special way and allows us to experience something of the supernatural, even if it's a poem that's not religious.
First, Bishop, thank you for coming. I very much appreciated your talk. My question was, I wanted to ask you if you had participated in any of the overseas trips that the IHP did, and if you did, what was your experience of those, like the trip to Ireland or to Greece?
Yes, so there were a number of overseas trips, because I said, traveling was also something that they felt expanded our horizons. And so my second semester, after I converted to the Catholic faith and had that conversation with my dad about, not being able to think on my own, the next month we went to Ireland for a whole semester. And it was beautiful, because we lived most of our time, there were 150 students in Galway, which is in Connemara, the west part of Ireland. And we spent half our time in the city of Galway and half our time on a little island called Inishbofin, which was 7 miles off the coast. Inishbofin, great Irish music, great beer, great, wonderful Irish people. But within 3 days, 2 of our classmates drowned off the coast. And I was on the island. And there were half of us, and they climbed out onto the stags, and the tide was going out, and when there were 4 of them. And so as the tide was coming in, they didn't realize that the causeway between the stags and the main island was being covered up. So 2 got across, and 2 stayed on the rock, and they decided they would try and risk it, and they were washed away in the sea. Tragedy. But that experience, I mean, we all, whenever you experience something really tragic like that, and I had just become a Catholic, and I remember there was a priest on the island who was we thought he was an old priest, but he was under 30. Father O'Connor, he became a father to all of us, and he walked us through that grief. And that bonded us, that whole experience. The university was going to fly all of us home. And they said, if you want to go home, we'll fly you home. But everybody decided to stay because Ed and Richard, the 2, and actually one of them is in here. One of them is pictured in this brochure. That bonded us as friends going through that tragedy like nothing else. And there was a playwright by the name of Brian McMahon, who's quite famous playwright, heard about the story and about the 2 Kansas college kids who drowned in the Stags off Inishbofin, and wrote a ballad, and it's still sung in the pubs in Galway about the 2 Kansas kids, and every now and then it'll be sung, in the pubs. So that experience, again, that was terrible, and it was a real tragedy. But that whole experience of being again, in nature and with the really real, but also traveling around in a country that is Ireland's under hard times now, but we had guest lecturers who were poets and artists that would come and kind of we studied a lot about Irish poetry and music during that time. But there were also trips to France and then trips to Greece and Rome as well. So the one I went on was one to Ireland, and those were formative, not just because of the tragedy, but formative in many ways.
Alrighty. Thank you so much for being here, Bishop. I first became familiar with the IHP from Scott Bloch's novel Mount Wonder about his experience. I loved it, and I was really caught by that phrase, let them be born in wonder. And my friends and I started to try to integrate it into our friendships. We stargaze, we teach each other how to dance, we share poetry. And that's been incredibly transformative, but I still have to read for classes, and for classes that don't teach me to read great books, and some that do, and I don't know how to read well. So how did you learn how to read properly, and how do I do that? To not just be born in wonder when I'm encountering reality, but to sit in front of the words in the page and actually encounter them.
I'm still working on that.
Okay.
And really, I am. And I make I have the bad habit of starting like 16 books at once and never getting past like the 2nd or 3rd chapter. I got them stacked up, but I keep plowing away at it. And one of the things I try to do these things every day. I try to read at least a half an hour. Sometimes I don't even get that in. Of a book, of some kind of book, whatever book I'm reading. I try to read one poem, again, and I've got these little poetry, like there's a treasure of English poetry here I'll put out there. And sometimes it's the same poems, I try to listen to a piece of music a day. Not just the Grateful Dead, but others, I try to get out for a walk, even if it's just for 10 minutes. So those are things that I'm still working on, and I'm not, I wish I could tell you I was a master at it, but I think we can be, I think we need to actually intentionally carve out time and just say, okay, this is just like you carve out time for prayer, right? Everybody does. You carve out time for eating. So you got to carve out some time for reading and put that in, and just start small, like a half hour. Not your classes, just a half hour. And when you think about a half hour, how many half hours do we waste during a day? I'm talking to myself. So we need to be, at least have that discipline to say, okay, I'm going to do that. And over time, you'll develop. It'll maybe expand to 45 minutes or an hour, and it'll help, I think, cultivate that love of learning and love of reading. That's a great question.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for coming here to Kansas. My question regards just, you're talking about living in wonder. And as I was thinking about the history of the country and just the world in general, particularly our nation, because we're so industrialized to get to this point, is that America began to industrialize early, and those industries featured factories, large buildings, people all moved to the cities. Like, you're talking about living in nature, living in wonder, and people began to not live in that all the time. I mean, like, you get up, you eat, you go work for who knows how many hours, you come back, you sleep. Then you do that on repeat till you die. And we wonder why we have such a depressing culture now. And that was all the way back in the 1850s. Right. And now it's come all the way up to now where we are so stuck in our heads, we're failing to function. I suppose my question is, like, for the vast majority of people whose lives revolve around getting up, going to work in an office or a factory floor, not in nature, and then having to come back where they don't really have the time to read, they have families, they have things they have to do. It's like, is there something we could do to change that cycle? So that way our work, like our Benedictines say, like we pray and we work. So that way somehow that 8 hours of our day is not spent doing something mindless, but doing something which actually brings us into context so that we can have that sense of wonder innate in us, as opposed to, because like having to carve out time, having to do all those things, they're very important, but I just know that for many, many people, they either don't have the capacity or they're not, and then they're going to be stuck in that depression and misery and the like, where it's hard to get out.
Right. I mean, yeah, that's the kind of the world in which we live. But at the same time, there and you always have to you have to work, you have to earn a living, right? And you're absolutely right about the industrialization of our culture, and it's a sort of a hyper, kind of workaholism, right, that we fall into. But also, there's a lot of opportunities, especially since the pandemic, that people are working from home, and you can carve out your own hours, and you don't have to be, at the workplace. That's a good thing that's happened. But also, I think too, it depends on, what you kind of where you live and what kind of job you have. I mean, there's always going to be kind of the drudgery of work, and you're never going to escape that. But I think creating beauty around you in the place where you live, in the community where you live, to build a community so you have people like-minded that you can share things with, so that it's not sort of a drudgery. Those are all kinds of creative ways, I think, and I think people are looking for that. So it's going to resonate with people. People don't like to be sort of like cogs in the machine, because it's not healthy. And so I think there's actually more openness to that kind of thing today than there has been in a while. But that's a good point. That's a challenge for all of us.
Bishop, once again, thank you so much. I think it's clear to all of us that the IHP has made a great impact in both education and the hierarchy here in the States, and especially here in the Midwest. I myself was taught by an IHP graduate, Howard Clark.
Oh gosh, yeah. One of my roommates.
Yeah.
That was not the one we were with, but
yeah.
My senior year.
But here at Benedictine, our goal is to transform culture in America. And all of us are entering into different fields as we go into our careers in the future. What are some other ways that the IHP impacted realms outside of education and the hierarchy that we can take inspiration from?
Well, I think that I can just think about some of my friends now, like Scott Block, who was talking about Mount Wonder. He's an attorney in Washington, D.C., and litigates some high-profile cases. So he became a very good attorney, but he hasn't lost that sense of wonder as well. In fact, he was able to write a novel. I don't know how he ever did that, at the same time. But he's got a good mind. But yeah, there are other ways I think that you can. I mean, a lot of us tried and kind of failed to live out in the country, and to raise. I spent a year and a half on a farm, kind of raising we didn't have running water, electricity, and we kind of, for a while, it was hard and it was failure. But anyway, we tried. But I think, rural living, you can kind of live like that. But the students who are in the program have become physicians, teachers, a lot of teachers like Mr. Clark, Howard Clark, a lot of teachers, attorneys, those kinds of things in all different fields, because really there's not one particular field that would be. It's the whole picture, and everybody has to find out what gifts they are and how they can serve God and the church in the best way they can. But yeah, did you go to, where were you at Blessed Sacrament? Okay.
We have just one last question from the back row here, and then you might know this person.
Oh yes, Professor.
Just a note that novel is fictionalized, not about the IHP.
Right.
HIP, Humanities Integrated Program. It's very different. We went links to really high, but it was really bad. My question is about friendship. I notice that among young people today, there's a lot of insecurity, and there is a consciousness of that maybe they don't bring a lot to the table. And one of the things that you mentioned was that the friendships in the program came as a result of the common experience of what they were reading, what they were discussing, what they were learning. Right? So could you comment on the fact that friendship is not, according to exuberity, not two people looking at each other, but looking in the same direction, and that the depth of the friendship is going to be proportional to the depth of the things that they.
Yeah, that's very good. I think that, what you're experiencing here, the friendships that are sort of developing around conversations that you have amongst each other, whatever you're studying, and it could be some, other things other than, just the kind of the learning environment that's created here. You're right, it's not two people kind of turned in on themselves, but it's looking out together at something larger than themselves, and then delighting in those kinds of things. And those friendships that you're forming now, and I could look around and see you guys, these friends, you're going to be with you. And then maybe you'll be separated in different cities, but you'll have had this common experience that you'll go back to, for years ahead. And those kinds of experiences where two people are sort of looking at something, and the great books and the study of the things that you're studying, they offer sort of almost like an environment to lift you out of yourselves, so that you will dream about other things beyond yourself, and that'll take you to places where you don't have this kind of atmosphere to do this in any place else. And those friendships and bonds are really precious. So make the most of this time, I guess is what I'm saying. Make the most of this time. It's going to go by quickly.
Well, let us all give a warm round of applause. Because we all know the best part of the lecture is the post-lecture questions that come up at the end when you're saying your goodbyes. There are copies of Bishop Conley's pastoral letter, and there are a few copies even of your letter on mental health out in the lobby.
Yeah, you can find it online too.
Also, if you're interested in the Humanities curriculum that Bishop is putting out throughout the year, I found it on the Southern Nebraska Catholic Register website, his column there. So he's got the American season is up, so Death Comes for the Archbishop was on the list by Willa Cather if you need an extra book to start your reading. But we're just so grateful, and thank you again. I failed to mention in the beginning, this lecture was sponsored by the Sheridan Center for Classical Studies. And so, yes, big fans. We are graduate programs in classical education, the honors program, the Great Books program, and many other things throughout the year. So thank you so much. Let us give one more thanks to Bishop Conley, and happy Feast of St. Cyril and Methodius.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.